Sounds good.
And I want to welcome everybody tonight. This is in many ways our first real installment of our Emanu-Elites speaker series. And I want to start actually by introducing John Landry. Many of you may not have known, but John, who is waving right now, not only is an incredible historian and writer and a wonderful member of our community, he is also a member of the Adult Learning Committee, and in that capacity has really chaired this Emanu-Elites speaker series, taken it upon himself at the suggestion of the entire committee to reach out to members with various expertise to teach us about what they know best, all connected to Judaism and Jewish studies in some way or another. So I am delighted that we are here tonight on a topic that I have been excited to hear about, and from a presenter that I have been excited to hear about for a long time. But I am actually now going to pass things off to John, and I just want to say a huge thank you, John. It is because of volunteers like you that our community keeps thriving, and really thank you for everything that you've done to make tonight and this whole series possible, and everything that you do in so many other corners of this community's life. So thank you, John, and take it away.
Okay. All right. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you for that introduction. I want to add that this is a series that we are considering for post-pandemic. I don't know if it's going to be in person or Zoom, but let's hope it's in person. But so if you have ideas for presenting, please keep in mind and suggest them to the committee. You know, you'll see in this series that it's not that you have to have a fancy dancy expertise in something. It can just be something you know really well and would like to share with people. So don't be, if you've got a passion around something Jewish that you'd like to talk about, then go for it. So I'd like to introduce Jill Pearlman, who is a longtime member of the congregation, who has, I know she's talked a bunch at Soulful about poetry, but not in any really formal way. And so I'm excited to hear her talk about it with us tonight. And so Jill, go ahead.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'm really excited to talk and to share. These are subjects very close to my heart. I am very taken with the beauty and demands of poetry, and the beauty of demands of Passover are very much synchronous. One thing that I'll be talking about is how the intersections of poetry and spirituality seem to me to weave in and out constantly. So I've worked for a long time as a writer in all kinds of different ways. I worked for a long time as a music and arts journalist, and traveled around a lot. I lived in France for about 10 years and grew up in Pittsburgh. I've lived in Providence for quite a while now. And for a while now, I've been working on poetry. I've become smitten. So it's a kind of, it's a devotion of a sort, but it's also a way to, it's a practice, and it can be kind of a spiritual practice as well. So that's what I'll be talking about. So like many of us, I've done a lot of thinking and ruminating during lockdown. And last week, as I was thinking about Pesach and thinking about this talk, I came to my aspiring and idealistic self. I made some resolutions about ways to liberate myself from my own obstructions. And this, I wanted to bring a lot of the insights and discoveries that I had made during lockdown into action, and to make insights matter for society. So this past Sunday, I attended a pre-Pesach Jewish retreat. And I was telling my partner, my Zoom partner, about this new resolve that I had about action. And as she was listening, she said she was visualizing Nashon charging toward the Reed Sea, having the courage to meet the unknown, even as water was rising up to the level of his nose. I thought that was, great image. Then about an hour later, we were asked to sit in meditation and set our intentions for Pesach. Of course, I already had my intentions because I had thought about it and came to the retreat with them already. But as I was sitting in this meditation and sitting in silence, I let deep parts of myself talk, essentially compose a poem. And what came out was very different than what I went in with. My internal conversation took me by the hand and shifted me in an entirely different direction towards witness. The Shulamite from the Song of Songs came into view. And I saw this push-pull way of desire and my relationship to it. Sometimes I seek, but sometimes I run away. I open the door, I keep the door shut, resistant, petulant, wanting more than I can handle. And as the Shulamite says to the daughters of Jerusalem, swear to me you will never awaken love until it is ready. That refrain resonated. So I moved towards a goal that I was ready for, which was trying to see reality as it is, in its good and its bad, of witnessing, of not wildly expecting, and in a word, good enough, and in a word, Dainu. So to me, that's a perfect example of how poetry is an intimate dialogue with the self and how it tells you what you're really thinking. The poet friend Leibovitz, writer friend Leibovitz says, I never know what I'm thinking until I write. The poet Yeats said, poetry is an argument with yourself. So these processes are non-linear. They spring surprises on you, they sneak up on you, they tell you unexpected things, just like the process of liberation itself. So I came to put together a project on Pesach and liberation through working with the texts of Aviva Zornberg, the brilliant Orthodox Torah scholar and feminist. She's been working in the realm of uncovering repressed, unconscious voices in Torah, of releasing what is hidden but lurking through the study of Midrash. I became fascinated with this very literary and very Jewish way of entertaining a whole array of voices, a multiplicity of energies, letting them be at the table, letting them knock against each other, to expand dimension and textures, to play like jazz, to come from multiple angles and mixed registers. So in Zornberg, many of those voices are feminine voices, desiring voices, voices of faith and acute perception that have been, that again, are there in Torah, they just aren't on the surface. And in a certain way, that idea echoed the work that I was doing in poetry. So first, I'd like to read a poem of childhood that I wrote called Released. In the middle of the poem, you'll hear some language that echoes the Reed Sea. Released. Father in the hallway calling, mother fretting on the cherry red carpeted landing. I'm leaning against father's shearling, thick and warm, musty wood shelves and walls. Alone in a closet with tears like Alice, rushing in a most delicious whirlpool. The foot, the leg swirling, the throat and tongue and mouth, the voice of many waters, without squared words, freed from the prison of being only one human. Gathered with all the waters, in choral praise of all, whirling it off centrifugally, trusting I'd come out again to dry my limbs and eyes and solidify for the time being. The dissolution worth the price of admission. This was almost fun, worth doing again. The poem speaks in different emotions, fantasy, longing, fear. They're flashes of dissolution, dissolving, of vertigo, of the nothing that one enters with courage, of not knowing what it will look like on the other side. There's a release from ego towards an experience that can initiate other experiences, a wave which can set off other waves. While the young woman is in the corridor of fear that Zornberg talks of, she has knowledge that the future is embedded in moments of the present. And in the particulars of rapture, Zornberg's book about Exodus, there are long, long passages about, really powerful passages about the women, their song, the being pressed again between, basically between death and a future, and the ecstasy that comes from that. So I love the details. I love the details of the salt, the sea, the dry land, the faith, the women's uncanny preparation for miracles in taking musical instruments with them. The courageous song of the sea inspires me over and over, just as it inspired our rabbis to include it in our daily liturgy. It is core in many ways, but we approach it differently every time. So in this idea of unconscious voices, how do we liberate a voice that's been stuffed away or stuck in a dark corner? Do you put a microphone to some repressed part of an individual or collective body and say, okay, now's your time, step on stage? For me, it happens by putting things in dialogue or in contrast with each other. Conversation is the whole fluid, is all. So when you have things that seem to contradict each other or seem like paradoxes, they jostle and they move and they push and they loosen and they free certain things. And in the in-between that comes of those harder things, you have a new third thing or a new thing. And that's the in-between space which you get a surprise. Sometimes something answers back that you weren't expecting, that you didn't know was invited to the room. And these are parts of the unknown, but in this way, this is much more like a reality where it's just not controlled. It's not really under your control. So here is another piece of the Passover conversation, another poem that's darker. As a poem, it's something like a sonnet. It's less personal. It starts with the world-weary voice of Ecclesiastes. It looks from the other perspective on desire, not from childhood, but from broken dreams, betrayals, and disappointment. It's still about desire. It turns on the idea that God wants us to desire. God wants us to want God. Sonnet for Passover during lockdown. Nothing is new under the sun, not even confinement. The sun is not new, narrow straits not new. The liberation story rolls like time in search of an ending. With Passover, we should be done, but we keep narrating, like old people forgetting we've already told it 3,000 times. The more freedom, the more we struggle to know what it means. The truth of Exodus is on trial, in crisis. Salt waters crest to our chins. Awestruck, we know nothing can be said, though we testify and babble in quivering attempt. We want to want more keenly. On high, the lover is never quite satisfied. He sees our desire raw, though not raw enough. In the way of the Shulamite, we leathernecks go in and out of our search. We get self-protective, self-righteous, read the signs the wrong way, etc., etc., etc. The divine is just on the other side of the curtain. It is flush with our daily lives, but we have to be open to it, be porous, hear and feel it. We have to desire to be open to it. Sometimes it seems we just keep repeating ourselves and our mistakes. So in those two poems, there are two different voices, two different stories. Sounds a lot like the discontinuity we sometimes see in our texts, like the multiple stories of Genesis, for instance. The writers are always revisiting, adding, doing embroidery, switches, gaps, pronoun changes. It's not an A to Z journey. It's not stable. Midrash comments on the gaps, holes, discontinuities, adding further texture and voices, both divine and human, in a way that's very exciting. In the poem also, I hear we Jews are always in the complexity of the God-human relationship, and we're always catching up, trying to imagine more, desire more, be more faithful. While the sonnet poem is darker, the door is never closed. There's always room for change, for transformation next year. God is there, miracles are there, daily miracles are there. But the requirements of letting go are difficult. I look back at myself during the pandemic. I usually think of myself as an open, porous-y poet kind of person. But in the crunch, when tested, voices of fear came up. The voices that kept me turned upon myself were very loud. I felt the need to hunker down, to solidify, to hold tight, to be more fixed. Some of the things that I'm often fighting against. So it's a discipline to be open and grounded. And in the way that Zornberg talks about many things of being a flickering modality, how we connect to the divine, how the divine appears to us, just this, our own being of how open we can be, and then need to go back to concrete and the things that we know. That's also some sort of flickering modality. But in the thinking of being in the desert, these stories of Passover and Exodus, where we are, what we've been reading, we're in the desert. We have a whole history, a whole narrative of how to learn to live in the desert and learning to live in between states, in between knowingness. So we've been taking lessons about how to build the Mishkan, looking to know if God is in our midst, essentially learning creativity. We learn to play, to create worlds. And one of the truths of being made in the image of God is to be a creator also. And there are many, many instances in building the Mishkan of Bezalel, of taking lessons from God about how to be an artist and about the divine charge of play, of moving things around, of reinventing, a kind of constant reinvention, which keeps things alive and in the flow and in a process, and allows us to be recreating the present in a way that continues into the future. And to be appreciative of the uncanny. This is a poem called Uncanny. The poem came to me in an uncontrolled, dreamy state. And it's also about an uncontrolled, dreamy daughter. In the poem, there's an interplay between wanting to control and having some guilt about not controlling. And on the other side, a wonder of things that happen outside our control. The poem uncanny. The baby was quite simply there, a thing as a star or a tree is unto herself, miraculous enough to rest by herself on a shelf with ink and paint indelible to survive without milk. Day 2. She wowed me with words on her lips, uterine heard lyric in full sentences. Day 3. I swear, standing there, she flowered, eye to eye with me in neon pink flush, with liquid life, reading to me from a book. I hear in that poem bits of creation. I hear the myth that in the womb, we all have the entire knowledge of Torah. And when we're born, an angel taps us on the lip and we forget everything that we knew. And we're charged with the process of relearning what we intuitively already know. I hear also, I hear things that are, I hear mystery. I hear things that are unknowable and a kind of both anguish and beauty of things that are unknowable and outside of us. Finally, so at the beginning I talked about how I was questioning my resolve, but I'm still very moved by the idea that we're charged in Pesah of working together with our generation, and that each generation moves the needle forward for the next generation. We are those waves in the ocean. I'm not giving up on action and Jewish on-the-ground pragmatism. I very much desire it. I think of the line in the first poem that we read, freed from the prison of being only one human. I feel that that's very central to me, to try to leave the confines of privacy, of myself, of the very narrow confines and defines of the individual, and to be a part of something larger, part of a larger people, a universality, part of the cosmos, a connection with God. And I see a lot in terms of song and in the stance of always singing to God, of living as a song. So here is a song of continuity. It starts probably in a place of repression, but the song is a kind of universal, maybe timeless song. And coincidentally, the poem is called The Song. The ignorant who know everything, as a trap door knows its frame, sing through sewed together teeth, the thud of feet and fist, a stony agony, far from the rhymes of we thousands who know nothing but the rocking of murmured conversation, the tarp of rhyme stretched from beginning to end and beginning again, words formed on lips, in fields, and in silence. To close, I thought I would give a taste of the pairing of a Zornberg text and a poem. First, I'll read a very short little text, and it comes from the Particulars of Rapture, which is a fantastic book that she has on the book of Exodus, and then a poem called All Too True. This is perhaps the measure of the inordinate love that comes from knowing that one is created in the image of God, of knowing that God's presence is in one's midst. For this, both continuity and discontinuity are necessary. The destructive dimension of fire in the sense of the inner essence, which is in a process of development. The poem, All Too True. When the world went down around Adam and Eve, all the humans grieved, all too. Every morning since, pairs leave minor Edens in despair. Those ecstatic lovers in the corner, those flowers exploding in magenta, who could tell them to mourn? How to explain to bitter souls there's no treason in the sun? To hold a radiant thing, spilling gold, spilling blood. Thank you. They're always, I thought we could have a little discussion, answer any questions, hear any comments. Of course, there are always more poems to read, but I would be happy if anyone had any questions, comments. I wanted to open further discussion, jump in and add anything.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. We're only about 20 of us, so I think we're small enough. If you have a question, why don't you just maybe raise your hand and I'll be looking for you, just so we don't too many talk at once. But why don't I start? Jill, maybe you could say a little more about how you write poetry. I'd be interested in, there are just a number of really evocative phrases, like, you talked about freed from the confines of being a single person, but I also liked how you sort of talked about being in the in-between place and how that's a place of creativity and play. When you write poetry, do you start with those phrases or ideas, or do you discover them in the process? Sort of what's the nub that's the core of the poem that you write?
Interesting question. I think I usually start from a place of the senses, a sensual place. I have a strong visual acuity, I love color. I love senses and the smells of things and music. So sometimes it's something will provoke or like start off an idea or a thought. And then I try and figure out why did that grab me? What's in it? Why did it get a hold of me? And often there is a strong, and then I start thinking about it. Sometimes I start kind of writing associatively. I'll come back or sit down and start writing, and in the writing, all kinds of phrases come up that I wasn't expecting, and often it'll go towards a kind of thought that is more is sort of cerebral. So in the mix, I think that already there's a dialogue. So already we have the sensual world and the sense of how we perceive, how then I'm thinking about it. And then usually then I begin to expand it further, and another kind of mode or another voice or questioning comes in. And so then you have kind of a party. And I do, a lot of these things are, you have some tradition that comes up. You find that within you have all these different layers, and a lot of the different layers come to the fore, whether it's Jewish learning, it's poems that I've heard, that have inside, poems that I've heard before, or all kinds of different things. So I'll try and shape it, because that sounds very amorphous. but that could be sort of all over the place. But I try and then sit with it and see what it's trying to say, this is something people say, they what is it saying to me, and how do I let it kind of flourish and grow, and then I prune it and shape it. That's one answer.
Great, thank you. Who else would like to ask a question? Just put up your hand. Yeah, Lewis.
Are you muted? Yeah.
Now you're muted.
How about now?
Good.
Okay. I'll get that before the pandemic is over. Where are you in each of these? Because these are all narrative based, or a lot of them were. Are you in the poem? Are you in the narrative? Are you a participant in the event? Are you a bystander observing? Or is this a story that you write about something that you feel has happened, or that has happened because you feel that it has happened, but you weren't there? I was wondering just that.
A lot of poets write from their life, from their stories. Sometimes it's called confessional poetry. There's a very deep inquiry into their own experience and own experience of their lives. I do less of that than many poets, but probably all of the poems have some, the poet is always there. Obviously, the poet you can't disassociate yourself, but you're kind of, if it's not a narrative that's directly, that doesn't stem from my life, like the poem about the first poem released was about, maybe an adolescent girl in a tantrum, kind of in a kind of pressed between different strictures, or maybe with conflicting desires or something. That was an experience directly from my life. I interpreted it in a broader way. I didn't tell the story of the boy that I was crying about, or whatever, which I thought seemed sort of embarrassing or not that interesting. But as I thought, but it was an instant, what I remembered it as was an instance of having so much emotion, in fact, like kind of like a tantrum or something, and the flood of tears. I remembered that experience of how cleansing in a certain way it was to have, release this tsunami of emotion. And so really the poem in a certain way is about, I would call it, kind of ecstasy of or transformative to passing from one state into another. So it goes from, in a certain way, from the solid body almost into another form, into a watery form, and this watery form sort of fascinated me. What is it like to leave your everyday body, your everyday being, and pass into an otherness? And so in the writing of the poem, it went from it it morphed from a very simple narrative, which it could have stayed. It still can be interesting to have a, what a first broken heart is like, or whatever. But my imagination took it into, I'm interested in processes, in metamorphoses of form, of shape. I'm interested I am interested in metamorphosis and in transcendent states and in other states. I have migraines. So I'm always, and for me, that's a change of form also. It's the body kind of dissolves a little bit. You have a certain breakdown and an otherness. So those are all ways that I am in the poems, but not in, as recognizable form as if I'm telling a narrative about my story, my life. And I'm also interested in, I'm very interested in this idea of how I cannot be just my own story. I do somehow feel sort of confined by just having one story. I feel like the individual is a challenge, is kind of a negative, something of a negative, and I'm always kind of wanting to be, to be a part of a larger nature, to have I have sort of a quote unquote mystical side. I have some poems about being, about states of early states of sort of religious experience, where there's kind of experience in a forest or a woods, and hearing, intuiting or feeling energies from outside, and kind of the joy of that, the relief of not being, stuck in the confines of the individual. So as a long way of answering, I'm kind of soaked in the poems, but not in a, but not in as recognizable way as you might see in some other poems.
That's interesting, because I found myself in them. When you were reading them. I felt like I was either a bystander or a participant. Maybe it's because of the thematic content of it, that it's about what it's about.
To me, that's a very positive response, very positive feedback. I sort of crave the idea of a humanness, I don't know if you can call it universality, but I think we should be, of being able to touch a core humanness in people. I think that art, for me, that's the high aim of art, to be able to cross from our little cells, and kind of in different ways. I mean, we all can have different ways of interpreting, reacting, but an emotional kind of buzz, opening of charge of some sort, is, yeah.
I wanted to sort of bounce off what Lewis said, because the comment that you could see yourself in it is something I also resonated with. And I think that the way you incorporate sensory cues and it being so visual, I was visualizing as you were talking. Whether it at all resembles what you visualize, I have no idea, but maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe it's the sense of being a participant as you listen, of becoming absorbed in the images and the thoughts. It's very nice.
Thank you. I love that, Margaret, because the thing about poetry is it's not, even though it uses words, they don't have to be literal. We think of, first of all, it's a combination of song and word. And, but because we use words for everything, including like our tax forms and voting and, the newspapers and advertising and everything, words become, this pragmatic tool, but sometimes, you can disassociate them from that and clean them off, and they can be like paint or, musical notes or an instrument or something like that. And I myself sort of like to flee from the literalism of words. So I love that, of sort of being able to soak in the, ambiance of that little experience or whatever. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
If I
I
may
think you're
also,
next.
if I may just quickly
Oh.
also add on this particular topic, what I think is so beautiful about these last comments, thinking about particularly that this is poetry of the Exodus story, is that part of the Exodus story and Passover is that we are supposed to see ourselves as having experienced the story. And I just wanted to comment on that your poetry is helping many of us to see ourselves in these moments and in these experiences, is another layer of what Passover really is all about. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Rabbi Zarin. That's excellent.
Thanks, Bob. You want to go next? Did you raise your hand, Bob?
Thank you. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
So the poetry, I could feel myself in it. I agree with the comment. I wonder if you could just talk about how difficult is it to put yourself out there to read a poem that you're so much a part of? I would think that would be terrifying.
Yes, I in a certain way, I guess part of the evolution of this process is releasing the poems. Also, there's a point where, I mean, it's kind of a cliche, but they take on a life of their own, or you release them like a child, and the child then goes on to walk and, go to school and go to college, do all kinds of things outside your control. But it's true that I actually have come to enjoy reading them. I like to read, and they sort of come to life. But I see when I was reading them on the page and speaking them, they do sort of have a life of their own. I'm not really sticking to their literal, to like when I wrote them, the distance between when I wrote them and now is a lot has happened in between. So I kind of let them go and not as attached to them in terms of exactly what they mean as I was, when I wrote them or a while ago. I'm very happy to, and I'm very happy to have listeners. The process of, again, this being in dialogue and having my voice to your ear is a very satisfying part of the process. So I'm very happy to have you here.
Oh, good.
Here. Yeah, Cynthia, sorry, I don't know. Cynthia? Yeah.
Yes, Cynthia. Sorry, I don't have my full name there. Cynthia Scheinberg. Hi, Jill.
Hi, Cynthia.
Thank you so much. That was really amazing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you think about poetic form. I'm a big fan of sonnets, and I was thrilled when you read the sonnet. And, how do you decide when you're headed towards a sonnet and when you're not?
That's a great question. I mean, one of the the fun challenges of form is how you can keep it from not being confining. So how you can play against it. A lot of form, you know, when we think of form, we think of it being traditional. You feel you know, the 4 lines are kind of like a box, and is that we didn't really grow up learning, you know, all the rhythms and the metrics and how to do all the traditional poetry. So I think for me, an interesting part of it is how can I bounce off the box of the form and kind of create like Baudelaire is a perfect example. I like to be a little bit anarchic within a form and still working in the form, still respecting the form, but in a playful way, like being, the image that I keep seeing is being like a rubber ball within a frame, and seeing where all that can it can be kinetic and get energy from. In terms of how and when, I've read a lot of sort of free verse, a number of actually poems where the line is the form. So and it becomes a series of lines, you know, very strong lines that are in a way complete within themselves, and then are piled together or talking to each other. And those lines they might be somewhat surreal or kind of witty or whatever, but they're contained within themselves. You know, that kind of the verbal birth of that is very different than where I'm not really sure where I'm going, and a number of different things spill out, and that might be a looser, more image-driven poem that doesn't feel compelled to resolve itself, even organize itself that strictly. And then I think the sonnet poem was, you know, in a certain way, it's sort of metaphysical and intellectual. It's an intellectual argument in a way. And so it really fed into the idea of a more traditional sonnet where you have this, you have an A, and then you have a B, and then you're responding back. And it ended up, I thought, oh, I'm so close to a sonnet, I could really make it 14 lines. And so I did, and I thought, well, that's really fun. So I think if it doesn't have a fun, if I can't be loose and think it's fun, I probably am not going to succeed with it, because then it'll impose on me. I have to be kind of comfortable, but so it's a playful thing. Thank you. Thanks so much, Cynthia.
Yeah. I have a question related to that, Jill, and it gets back to what you were saying earlier about being, in the Exodus time, sort of, and then right after in the wilderness, there is a sense of it's an in-between place, and it's a time of a lot of creativity. And for me, it's sort of the famous irony of Passover, which is that it's this time of freedom, but it's also this time of order and doing things a certain way and building the Mishkan a certain way. And yet there is this freedom, and how do you understand that? And it occurs to me, based on what you're saying, and you show it a little bit, that, in a way, what we're talking about here is maybe better expressed in some ways in poetry, which is more anarchic, like you're saying, than the text we usually work with. And is that something that you sort of work with when you sort of think about Passover? Does it just emerge spontaneously? Does it happen in retrospect? Like, how did you sort of come around to that in your poems on it?
It is an interesting question. I don't think I mean, except for this poem of the sonnet about Passover during lockdown, I don't really sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write the poem about Passover. But these themes of liberation, of freedom, of passage, of struggle, of hardship, of impediment and things not working and forces that fall upon you that you don't expect or don't know how to handle are so universal. They really are so much a woven part of our lives that I might start with start by thinking about some conflict, but always trying to understand, we know we have all these blessings. We know that there's so much tragedy, and how do we balance the two? How do we not ping pong back and forth between an absolute on one side, an absolute on the other side? How do we hold them both at the same time? And I think that's the process. Somehow that's the process of maturity. That's the but it's but it's a hard one. It's hard one. And anyway, a long circuitous answer to I feel like a lot of the themes of Passover are embedded in our Jewish experience and in our human experience. And so the imagery of Passover, of the desert, of the song will come up, will just sort of erupt, will come to me, a lot of the images when thinking about some of these other larger issues, because they're in me, because they're there. I do also read, I have spent a lot of time reading. I really like these Zornberg texts, and they, they're so rich, there's so much there. So I can open the book, a small passage will inspire all kinds of things. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about the women's song, and about the women's, the women's faith, and about the limits of reason, and how in the story, the women are the ones who are able to make the leap, who make the leap through the cautions of reason, or the cerebral thinking. They can go outside the brain and kind of make the leap into song. And the song is is both a song of, it's not even quite a song of thanks. It's a song of preliminary, like hopeful, anticipatory thanks. And this and that idea is just so powerful. How can we, and that idea of anticipating miracles, but anticipating being thankful, having the courage or the faith or the nerve or the whatever to just, go that imaginary step and put yourself there. I think that's part of being able to go into the unknown, to sort of open yourself, to float yourself to, in the unknown, to be able to get to the other side. And that's, in a certain way, that's what a creative process is like. That's what writing a poem is like. You really don't know when you start how it's going to end. You don't know what the process is. You're in it, but you're not there, and it might not work. It might not, whatever. But there's always a process of not knowing, of kind of a certain terror There's a process of a certain terror because you don't know where you are at a certain point, and you're in a kind of nothingness. And then if you have enough faith to hold on, like if you don't, rush for cover, but you hold on and stick with it, just stay with it, not like will it, but just stay with it, you might be able to get to the other side. And so I think that's one reason why I'm so attracted to the women's song, to the passage through the sea. And it seems like a message for us through life as people of faith, or people who want to be of faith, people who always want to have more faith. These are just questions of being, and questions of faith.
Great. Thank you. We have time for one more question or comment. Anybody else? Yeah. Rabbi Zarin?
Only if no one else has anything they wanted to ask. I'm curious how this process of writing these poems has perhaps changed your experience of Passover, if it has changed your experience of the Seder or of Passover in general.
That's a nice question. I think the idea that we rewrite the Haggadah or reimagine the story every time it might be related to rethinking and reconfiguring the poems in a way that speaks to some angle at that, some need at that time. And also, so the, how do we tell the story for this generation? How do we tell the story for this year? How do we tell the story? There's always there are 4 ways of telling this story. There are 4 different voices telling this story. All of that is so, it's so Jewish in a way. And honestly, I think it's something that that Judaism really has to say to the world, is something, people are so polarized in their complete fixated single mono view or tone or voice, and the ability to speak 2 things, speak 2 truths at one time, or to say things, to be able, one, not only to hear someone else, but to imagine that there could be 2 ways or 3 ways or 4 ways of telling or saying or hearing or interpreting. I think that's just so deep and powerful, and a truth that is the world is wanting to hear. It sometimes leaves us sort of open to too many contradictions, so we need to be grounded. But to have the ability, the empathy and imagination to hear different stories or different ways, that's something that I hear in Passover and in the Seder, and I appreciate.
Thank you. Okay, we're out of time, but thank you, Jill, for sort of, as Rabbi Zarin said, sort of starting us off and giving us a lot to sort of think about, or if that's too rational, sort of mull about or experience when we approach Passover, and just in general about the sort of one of the things I always like about poetry, I'm such a rational guy, I like how it kind of stimulates other parts of my brain. So thank you. So in a few weeks, on April 6th, after Passover, we'll have our next speaker, Rabbi Joshua Bolton. Thank you, Rabbi Zarin just posted the calendar. I'm sorry. Yeah, on April 6th, yeah, with Rabbi Bolton, Poetry in a Time of Prose. So he's also going to be sharing some of his poetry, but with much more of a focus on the pandemic and what it means for Judaism. And so I hope you can join us for that too.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to share with you, and thank you for being attentive listeners and in the discussion with me.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you, John, for arranging this and moderating. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And Hag Sameach.
Hugs